Okay, so we're well on the way to getting our super wrist control created. In this video I'd like to set up two more control objects, one for the attached rotations, one for the detached rotations, and then I want to go ahead and promote up handles to our asset for controlling those three control objects, the IK handle and the two wrist controls. So with that, I'm going to jump inside our asset, and the first thing I'd like to do is wire a null off of our fetch wrist control arm parent, so that we can create our control object that's going to be affected by the arms. It's going to be our attached control object. I'm going to name this wrist control underscore arm parent. Give this a blue node color since we are dealing with a control object. I want to link the wireframe color to our standard wireframe color parameter on our asset. So I'm going to right click and copy that parameter. Jump down inside on the Mist tab, right click and paste copied relative references onto our wireframe color. Let's go ahead and set up our control type to be circles. We're dealing with a rotational control. I also want to boost up our geometry scale just slightly. Somewhere around there will work fantastically for us. Now this is a rotational control, so I'm going to lock our translates, lock our scales, and lock our pivot as well, so that we only deal with rotations. So now we can go ahead, repeat this process for our detached wrist control. So I'm going to right click and wire our fetch wrist control master control parent into a new null. This will be our wrist control underscore master control parent. Again, blue node color since we're dealing with a control object. Now in this case I'm going to introduce a new color convention in terms of wireframe color. So far we've been dealing with blue controls because we're working on the left hand side of our character. I now want to introduce the concept of an orange control, meaning a detached control, as opposed to any other color control, meaning an attached control. And this is something that's going to crop up again in the next DVD, where we're dealing with a lot of detached and attached controls. Orange will always be a wireframe color that indicates that that control is detached from other parts of the rig. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an orange wireframe color. Again, we're dealing with circles. And again, I want to boost the geoscale slightly smaller than before, so that it sits just inside our other control, but so that it is larger than the IK handle. Again, we're dealing with rotations, lock our translates, lock our scales, both scales and uniform scale, and lock our pivot as well. So we're dealing solely with rotates. So now that we've got that in place, I want to promote up that wireframe color to our asset. Since we've set this new standard of having orange as a detached control, it makes sense that if someone wants to change that, we could put that on the asset. If someone used the asset, they could change that particular parameter. So I'm going to bring up the type properties for our asset, and I'm going to promote up from nodes inside our super wrist control on our wrist control master control parent on the Mist tab, our wireframe color, making sure we don't have prefix name or label, into our super wrist control folder, and this will become our detached wireframe color, which I'll give the name of detached wireframe color. If we accept that, we can see now that our detached control indeed is linked to our asset. So now that all that's left to do in this video is to promote up some handles to our asset. To do that, I'm going to bring up the type properties for the asset. I am actually just going to move this off to the side. It's still open. I want it still open, but I obviously want to be able to see what I'm working with in terms of the viewer as well. So do note that this is still open, but I want to be able to promote up certain handles. So I'm going to jump inside our asset. I'm going to select our arm IK handle. And you can see that if we select the Show Handles tool, we can see that we have access to the translation handle. I want to promote this handle to our asset. So I'm going to right click on the handle, and I'm going to come down to Export Handle, not Export Parameters, which will only export certain parameters. I want to also export the handle. I'm going to export the handle to our digital asset. If I bring back up our type properties, you can see all of the parameters that we needed to be promoted in order for that handle to work successfully have indeed been promoted. I'm going to create a new folder for these parameters, and I'm going to name this to IK handle. I'm going to drop all these parameters into that folder. I'm going to move that folder underneath our super wrist control. Now in a second I'm going to lock all but the translate parameter, then we can come back in and hide these, make them invisible. But it's worth noting on the handles tab we now have a new handle that's been created. This is a handle on our asset. When we select our asset and tell it to show us the handles, this will be one of the handles that we see. Now I want to rename this handle since it's possible for the animator to see the names of these handles, and I want them to easily be able to work out which handle's what so that they can deal with toggling the visibility of those handles. So I'm going to name this to something like IK handle. So we can now go ahead and I'm going to apply that. So if we jump up and select our asset now, you can see that we are indeed seeing handles. If I force it to show me the handles, we're seeing handles, and we're actually seeing that entire handle because we haven't yet locked certain parameters. Let me bring back the type properties, jump up our parameters, and actually I want to be on the parameters for the asset rather. So we've got our IK handle, we know we can only deal with translations, so I'm going to lock rotations, scales, lock the pivot, lock the uniform scale, the transform order, and the rotate order. And that means now if we select our asset, all we're going to see is a translation handle, and that translation handle deals with translating our IK handle. Now I've got point snapping on, which is slowing us down a bit. There we go. So it's handle, but it's only dealing with translating the IK handle. It's not translating our asset. It's a handle driving parameters that are on our asset, which are then themselves being referenced by our IK handle. So now I can bring back up the type properties, which I do have over here, and I'm going to hide out, make invisible all the parameters except for our translates. If I apply that and just slide this off to the side, you'll see that now I have the translates only visible. We know that we have our other parameters promoted, but they've been locked, so the handle knows about them, but it can't modify them. We can only modify our translates. So that's our translates for the IK handle in place, and since they have been promoted, they are now referenced. Our match IK to FK will also function correctly. Let's repeat this process now with our rotations as well. So I'm going to go ahead, and I do still have the type properties open. So I'm going to just make sure that you can see that we do still have the type properties open. I'm going to jump down and now grab the wrist control for the arm parent, and with our show handles tool active, I'm going to right click and export that handle to the digital asset. It's again going to promote up a ton of parameters that we need for that handle to work correctly. So let's bring out a new folder. I'm going to rename this to attached wrist control. We're dealing here with the wrist control that is attached to our arm. I'm going to put all of these parameters inside that folder, and I'm going to jump over to the handles tab where we can see that we have a handle that's been promoted. I'm going to rename this to our attached wrist control. So now if we were to get the name of the handle, we'd see that this is the attached wrist control. We can apply that, and now we can see if we jump up and take a look at our parameters for the asset, we actually have our attached wrist control. Now it's currently not in the correct location on our asset, and that's fine, but I do want to lock everything except for the rotates on that control. So let's lock everything except for the rotates. Then we can jump back into our type properties. I can hide out everything except for our rotates by checking they're invisible, then move this folder up inside our existing super wrist control folder. Now since we only have one parameter in each of these folders, it doesn't make sense to have them as tabs. If we apply just for a second, it doesn't make sense to have them as tabs. The reason I've got these folders more than anything is to keep the parameters in our type properties organized so that we know these are transformation parameters that relate to a certain item, rather than for the parameters on our asset itself to have a tab-based organization. If I grab our IK handle folder and I check end tab group and apply, you'll see that what that does is it forces it to not have a new tab group, so we can see these. Yes, they are grouped in a folder, but at least we can see them all on the same page. In the next DVD, when we do promote up everything to our asset, we're actually going to ignore this folder setup, and we're actually going to have them promoted in a different way. But for now, while dealing with our wrist control, it makes more sense to keep these in folders for our type properties so that everything is nice and organized. Now, it's worth pointing out again, if we take a look at our handles on our asset, we have that translation handle, and notice how they can be separate. Notice how the translation handle can be separate from the rotation, and notice how the translation handle is dealing with our IK, and the rotation is dealing with our attached wrist control. So we now have the ability, if we were dealing with IK, to position our wrist and rotate our wrist, all without selecting between these two items. Of course, we can select these items and work with them on their own if we wanted, and when the asset is locked, we will not be jumped down inside the asset. So let's zero out the IK handles translation. Let's repeat this one last time for the detached wrist control. So I do still have my type properties open. So let's jump inside and grab the detached wrist control. That's the master control parent wrist control, and I want to right click and export that handle to our type properties as well. So let's go ahead, create a new folder. This will be our detached wrist control. Promote these parameters. Well, the parameters have been promoted for us, the parameters needed for our handle to work, and we can go ahead, place that inside a folder, move that folder inside our super wrist control, check and tab group on the attached wrist control. Also go ahead, jump over to the handles tab and rename that handle to detached wrist control. So we've got all that promoted. Now if we apply, we can see if we jump up to our asset level that we do indeed have that on our asset. We can lock everything except for the rotation parameters. Fantastic. Jump back over here and we can make everything except for the rotation parameters invisible. With that, I am going to accept and close out our type properties. Now you'll notice if we select the asset, we have two handles for rotation in our view, one for the attached and one for the detached, and this could become very confusing to an animator because they can very easily become overlapped. It could be very hard to select one over the other, and this would become very confusing. We do, of course, have the ability to toggle the visibility of these controls in the view, and this is something that I'd expect the animator to be able to do. So if they're working either with the pose tool or with the show handles tool, and our rig is designed to work with the pose tool or the show handles tool, and what I mean by that, let me just save our asset and match the current definition. Fantastic. We don't want to work with our rig using translation, then rotation, etc. tools, and that doesn't make sense because if we're dealing with different components in our rig, if we select this guy, yes we can translate, we switch over to rotate, yes we can rotate, but we can't get access to both. Then we grab our rotation, sure we can rotate, we try and switch to translate, it's not going to show as a handle. If we're on the show handles tool, no matter what we select, we see all of the available handles on that object, so it's very quick for an animator to work. It's the exact same thing if we were to activate the pose tool. I'm going to push tab over the viewer and activate the pose tool. We get the exact same thing with the pose tool. So this is designed to work with both the pose tool and the show handles tool, and that's good because it means that we can select our super wrist control, we see those handles, but we can now right click on the show handles tool, and this works. We notice we are indeed in the pose tool. This will work for both the pose and the show handles tool. We can right click, see the names of the controls that we specified ourselves, IK handle, detached wrist control, attached wrist control. I can turn off the visibility of certain controls and only work with certain controls. So I could turn off the visibility of our IK handle if I wanted. I can turn that back on. I can turn off the visibility of the attached handle and bring up the visibility of the detached handle. So we do have complete control. This is something that as a rig developer, when you give the rig to an animator, you would explain to them if they weren't necessarily comfortable with working with the pose tool or working with handle visibility. You would need to obviously explain to them how that works, but once they've had a very quick introduction, it's going to now be very quick for them to work with either control object and work with both the wrist control for orientation and for translation at the same time. So that's going to actually conclude setting up the handles, and then in the next video we'll take a look at setting up the blending between the wrist controls and getting that affecting our wrist itself. So with that, that will conclude this video. Thanks a lot, everyone.